Holy Bible, the book of First Samuel. We're going to continue where we left off. We're going to start from chapter 16. This is where David comes in. Okay, David is anointed king. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you go on grieving over Saul? I have rejected him as king of Israel. But now, get some olive oil and go to Bethlehem, to a man named Jesse, because I have chosen one of his sons to be king." "How can I do that?" Samuel asked. "If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." The Lord answered, "Take a calf with you and say that you are there to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will tell you what to do. You will anoint its king as king the man that I tell you to." Samuel did what the Lord told him to do and went to Bethlehem, where the city leaders came trembling to meet him and asked, "Is this a peaceful visit, seer?" "Yes," he answered. "I have come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Purify yourselves and come with me." He also told Jesse and his sons to purify themselves, and he invited them to the sacrifice. So we have some information here. In spite of the fact that it was a small town in Judah, Bethlehem was a well-known place to the Jewish people. It was when Jacob and his family were on their way to Bethel that his favorite wife Rachel died near Bethlehem while giving birth to Benjamin. This is in Genesis 35. It was also in Bethlehem that Ruth, the widow from Moab, found her husband Boaz and gave birth to Obed, David's grandfather. This is in Ruth chapter 4. David himself would make Bethlehem a famous place, and actually so would Jesus, the son of David, who would be born there, as the scriptures promised in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Bethlehem means house of bread, and guess what? It was there that the living bread from heaven came to dwell in human flesh in Bethlehem. As Israel's judge and prophet, Samuel had the right to travel where he pleased in serving the Lord and his people. But these were difficult and dangerous times because King Saul, was a very suspicious man, and his spies would report anything that Samuel did. From Samuel's home in Ramah, the road to Bethlehem passed by Gibeah, which is where Saul had his headquarters. So now you know why Samuel was a little bit apprehensive. And Saul would want to know where Samuel was going and why he was going there. To avoid problems, God commanded his servant to take a heifer, a cow, and announce that he would sacrifice a fellowship offering to Bethlehem for a select group of people, including Jesse and his sons. Then God would show Samuel which one to anoint as king. So the elders in Bethlehem knew that Saul and Samuel were estranged. They were not getting along, in other words. So the arrival of Samuel gave them great alarm. Was Samuel recruiting followers to resist Saul? Would Saul interpret his presence in their little town as a declaration of war? Samuel quickly allayed their fears and told them to sanctify themselves and come to the sacrifice and the feast that was to follow. Sanctify means that each of the guests would take a bath and change clothes, because nobody ceremonially unclean could participate in the sacrificial feast. This is from back in Leviticus chapter 7. For Jesse and his sons to be invited to this feast was actually a very high honor. And of course, nobody but Samuel knew why they were included. Let's continue. When they arrived, Samuel saw Jesse's son, Eliab, and said to himself, "This man standing here in the Lord's presence is surely the one he has chosen." But the Lord said to him, "Pay no attention to how tall and handsome he is. I have rejected him, because I do not judge as people judge. They look at the outward appearance, but I look at the heart." Then Jesse called his son Abinadab and brought him to Samuel. But Samuel said, "No, the Lord has not chosen him either." Jesse then brought Shammah. "No, the Lord has not chosen him either," Samuel said. In this way, Jesse brought 7 of his sons to Samuel. And Samuel said to him, "No, the Lord has not chosen any of these." So now we have a situation here, right? Samuel cannot find the person that he's supposed to anoint. So before the guests sat down to enjoy the fellowship feast, Samuel looked over 7 of Jesse's sons, thinking that the whole family was there, that he was operating by sight and not faith. We don't know what Samuel's 2 sons looked like, but we do know that their father, Samuel, admired men who were handsome and well-built. Samuel, remember, he admired Saul? Samuel had already forgotten this mistake he had made about Saul. David was the 8th son, and only 6 of his brothers are named in Scripture: Eliab, the firstborn; Abinadab, the second; Shimea, the third, also called Shammah, by the way; Nathanael, or Nathaniel, the 4th; Radai, the 5th; and Ozem, the 6th. This is all in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, by the way, in verse 13 to 15. David is called the 7th in this genealogy, but we have a situation here. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 10 to 11 makes it clear that he was the 8th and youngest son. Apparently, one brother died without issue, and his name dropped out of the genealogy. David also had 2 sisters. Zeruiah was the mother of Abishai, Joab, and Asahel, and Abigail, who was the mother of Amasa. This is in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 16 through 17. All of these men played important roles in David's kingdom. That's why I mentioned them all. Now, no doubt that there was no family in Bethlehem that could boast having 7 such brothers, men of strength and stature, and yet none of them was God's chosen king. Samuel may have looked at their faces and their forms, but the Lord examined their hearts. God alone can search the human heart and know what a person's motives really are. Okay, let's continue now. Then he asked him, "Do you have any more sons?" Jesse answered, "There is still the youngest, but he is out taking care of the sheep." "Tell him to come here," Samuel said. "We will not offer the sacrifice until he comes." So David's occupation, he was a shepherd. There's a lot of information here, but it's pertinent, though. It is important. So insignificant was David in the family that Jesse did not even call him from the flock to the feast. Now, Saul was hiding among the baggage. We're talking about Saul. Saul was hiding among the baggage when Samuel called for him. But David was busy caring for his father's sheep. Now, there's very deep meaning about this that I'm going to discuss right now. In the Old Testament times, kings and their officers were looked upon as shepherds. Kings and officers, okay? They were looked upon as shepherds of the people. And David was a man with the heart of a shepherd. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 8, by the way. God's church today is a flock, and each spiritual leader needs to have the heart of a shepherd and lovingly care for God's lambs and sheep. This is from John chapter 10, John chapter 21, and 1 Peter 5. Now, one thing about sheep, we talked about this when we discussed Psalm 23. You can drive cattle, but you have to lead sheep, or they will scatter. The shepherd must know his sheep individually. He must love them and take care of them according to their needs. For the most part, sheep are defenseless and do not see well, so they depend on the shepherd to guide and protect them. Although David was a literal shepherd who was called to be a national shepherd, he saw himself as one of the Lord's sheep and wrote about it in Psalm 23. This psalm was not the product of a young man, but of a seasoned saint who looked back at a long life and confessed that the Lord had been faithful to him all the days of his life. David was exactly the kind of leader Israel needed to repair all the damage that Saul had done to the nation. Now, here's something else that is interesting that you guys will, hopefully you guys will acknowledge. God calls people who are busy. He does not call people who are looking for ways to avoid responsibility. I'll give you some examples. Moses, Gideon, Elisha, Nehemiah, Amos, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and Matthew. These were all busy when the Lord called them. God's pattern for leadership is stated in Matthew 25, verse 21. He says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord." David had been faithful as a servant over a few things, and God promoted him to being a ruler over many things, from a flock to a whole nation. Now, unlike Saul, David could be trusted with exercising authority because he had been under authority and had proved himself faithful. And at this time in his age, David was not older than 17, possibly 15, 16, or 17. I'll discuss why in a couple of verses, why we can deduct his age. So let's continue. So Jesse sent for him. He was a handsome, healthy young man, and his eyes sparkled. The Lord said to Samuel, "This is the one. Anoint him." Samuel took the olive oil and anointed David in front of his brothers. Remember this part. David was anointed in front of his brothers. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. Immediately the Spirit of the Lord took control of David and was with him from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. So, while the physical appearance was not the most important thing for a king, David was so striking in his appearance that the Lord called our attention to it. Let's go to 12 now. So Jesse sent for him. He was a handsome, healthy young man, and his eyes sparkled. The Lord said to Samuel, "This is the one. Anoint him." Samuel took the olive oil and anointed David in front of his brothers. Immediately the Spirit of the Lord took control of David and was with him from the day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. Okay, so David in Saul's court. The Lord's Spirit left Saul, and an evil spirit sent by the Lord tormented him. His servants said to him, "We know that an evil spirit sent by God is tormenting you. So give us the order, sir, and we'll look for a man who knows how to play the harp. Then when the evil spirit comes on you, the man can play his harp, and you will be all right again." Saul ordered them, "Find me a man who plays well, and bring him to me." One of his attendants said, "Jesse of the town of Bethlehem has a son who is a good musician. He is also a brave and handsome man, a good soldier, and an able speaker. The Lord is with him." So Saul sent messengers to Jesse to say, "Send me your son David, the one who takes care of the sheep." Jesse sent David to Saul with a young goat, a donkey loaded with bread, and a leather bag full of wine. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much and chose him as the man to carry his weapons. Then Saul sent a message to Jesse, "I like David. Let him stay here in my service." From then on, whenever the evil spirit sent by God came on Saul, David would get his harp and play it. The evil spirit would leave, and Saul would feel better and be all right again. So, let's see here. Hold on, let me make sure I have everything here. So David knew that the Lord had been present at his conception, and had arranged for his genetic structure. He ordained that David would be strong and handsome, that he would possess musical talent, and he would be prudent and brave, just as Paul was a vessel prepared by God for a specific work. So David was God's prepared servant to accomplish his purpose for his people. Now, Saul's attendants knew that something was seriously wrong with their master, and they rightly attributed to the attacks of an evil spirit. God had permitted, this is going to be kind of important, God had permitted this spirit to trouble Saul as part of his discipline because of the king's rebellion. By nature, Saul was a suspicious and revengeful man, and this gave the evil spirit a foothold for his operations. Remember Ephesians chapter 4, verse 27, do not give the devil a foothold. The one man in the kingdom who was prepared to minister to Saul was David. Now, David was a poet and a musician. He was skilled at playing the harp and composing songs. By the end of his life, he was known as the sweet psalmist of Israel in 2 Samuel 23. It is unusual to find such artistic talent in a man who was also a rugged soldier and a fearless general. He wrote psalms, organized the music ministry for the temple. Yes, he did that in 1 Chronicles 25, by the way, and provided instruments for the musicians. From the spoils of his many battles, he provided the materials for the temple, and he longed to have the privilege of building a house for the Lord. David did. No matter how you examine his life and abilities, you find that David to be a unique individual, and he was that way before God made him that way. It was David's musical ability that introduced him into the royal court, and then he was promoted to military service. The opportunities of life matched his giftedness, and David was wise to obey the will of the Lord, just as he refused to wear Saul's armor when facing Goliath. We'll read about that next. So he rejected that which was not prepared and planned for him by the Lord. In other words, in Psalm 23, verse 3, remember, he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So the key to David's success in life is stated in 1 Samuel 16. The Lord is with him. This was also the secret of the success of Joseph, Joshua, and Samuel, for that matter. And that is the basis for success in the Christian life today. David knew his gifts, and he experienced the power of God in using these gifts in his daily life. He loved the Lord, and he worshiped him, and he surrendered himself to do the work God had called him to do. As long as he followed the Lord, God blessed and used them for his glory. Okay, let's continue here. 17. Goliath challenges the Israelites. Now, remember I told you to remember two things? That his brothers were there witnessing how David was anointed as king, even though he wasn't good to become a king yet, but he was anointed, right? And then I told you about how we can guesstimate how old David was when he was anointed, roughly maybe 15, 16, no older than 17. I'll explain to you why in this chapter. So, chapter 17. The Philistines gathered for battle in Soko, a town in Judah. They encamped at a place called Ephes Dammim, between Soko and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in Elah Valley, where they got ready to fight the Philistines. The Philistines lined up on one hill and the Israelites on another, with a valley between them. A man named Goliath from the city of Gath came out from the Philistine camp to challenge the Israelites. He was over 9 feet tall and wore bronze armor that weighed about 125 pounds and a bronze helmet. His legs were also protected by bronze armor, and he carried a bronze javelin slung over his shoulder. His spear was as thick as the bar on a weaver's loom, and its iron head weighed about 15 pounds. A soldier walked in front of him carrying his shield. Goliath stood and shouted at the Israelites, "What are you doing there, lined up for battle? I am a Philistine, you, slaves of Saul. Choose one of your men to fight me. If he wins and kills me, we will be your slaves. But if I win and kill him, you will be our slaves. Here and now I challenge the Israelites' army. I dare you to pick someone to fight me." When Saul and his men heard this, they were terrified. David was the son of Jesse, who was an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and at that time Saul was king. He was already a very old man. His 3 oldest sons had gone with Saul to war. The oldest was Eliab, the next was Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. David was the youngest son, and while the 3 older brothers stayed with Saul, David would go back to Bethlehem from time to take care of his father's sheep. Goliath challenged the Israelites every morning and evening for 40 days. One day, Jesse said to David, "Take a half a bushel of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and hurry with them to your brothers in the camp. And take these 10 cheeses to the commanding officer. Find out how your brothers are getting along and bring back something to show that you saw them and that they are well. King Saul, your brothers, and all the other Israelites are in Elah Valley fighting the Philistines." So David got up early the next morning, left someone else in charge of the sheep, took the food, and went as Jesse had told him to. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelites were going out to their battle line, shouting the war cry. The Philistines and the Israelite armies took positions for battle, facing each other. David left the food with the officer in charge at the supplies, ran to the battle line, went to his brothers and asked how they were getting along. It seems reasonable, right? As he was talking with them, Goliath came forward and challenged the Israelites as he had done before. And David heard him. When the Israelites saw Goliath, they ran away in terror. "Look at him," they said to each other. "Listen to his challenge. King Saul has promised to give a big reward to the man who kills him. The king will also give him his daughter to marry and will not require his father's family to pay taxes." David asked the men who were near him, "What will the man get who kills this Philistine and frees Israel from this disgrace? After all, who is this heathen Philistine to defy the army of the living God?" They told him what will be done for the man who killed Goliath. So David did not remain in Saul's camp permanently, but went back and forth between the camp and home as he was needed. In case you guys don't understand, when Moses did the census in the wilderness, he called for people who were of fighting age from 20 years and up. So this kind of tells you that David is under 20 at that point, but he's actually younger, a few years younger, maybe 7. At this point now, he's probably like 17 or 18 at this point, because he was not allowed to actually join the military yet. That's why he was still a shepherd going back and forth to carry food to his brothers, because unlike the military nowadays, in those days, they couldn't be supplied with food. They had to get their own food or have their family take food to them, the soldiers. So it wasn't until after David killed Goliath that Saul took him permanently to be one of his armor bearers. David was a spirit-led man, and his every decision was to be in the will of God and for the glory of God. Others might come and go as they pleased, but David was guided by the providential hand of God. Goliath is described as standing 9 feet 9 inches tall, wearing a coat of mail that weighed 125 pounds, and carrying a spear that weighed 15 pounds. He was a formidable opponent indeed. He had presented himself to the army of Israel each morning and evening for 40 days. Remember, 40 days is a way of testing. And apparently David arrived on the final day. It's so beautiful the way God works, his timing. God knows what he's doing. Jesse chose just the right day to send David to the battlefield to carry food supplies to his three brothers and their commanding officer. Like I said, unlike modern armies, soldiers in ancient armies had to provide their own rations and help provide for others. So David was up very early that day and heard the morning challenge Goliath gave to Saul and his army. If the Israelites could provide a champion who was able to defeat Goliath, the Philistines would submit to the Jews and be their servants. But if not, the Israelites must consider themselves defeated and become the servants of the Philistines. Unfortunately, nobody in the Jewish army volunteered, including King Saul, for the matter, who stood head and shoulders above his men. Since Israel had come to a crisis in this confrontation, Saul made a generous offer to the man who would silence Goliath. He would marry one of the king's daughters, receive great riches from the king, and take his father's house off the tax rolls. So Saul hoped that somebody would be tempted by the offer and try to defeat Goliath. David's response to Goliath's arrogant speech was that of a total disgust. Who was this uncircumcised Philistine to blaspheme the name of the God of Israel? Now keep in mind that David was too young to serve in the army, as we talked a little while ago. But he was acting as though anybody in the camp who had faith in Jehovah could challenge Goliath and defeat him. But all that he saw were men fleeing from the field at that very sight of the giant. And even King Saul was terrified. God had brought David to the camp in such a time as this, perfect timing, and he was ready to accept the challenge. 28. Eliab, David's older brother, heard David talking to the men. He became angry with David and said, "What are you doing here? Who is taking care of those sheep of yours out there in the wilderness? You smart aleck, you just came to watch the fighting." See, I told you earlier that his brothers were witnessing the anointing by Samuel of David, right? So they were, as they say, as one prophet one time said, they were hating on him. You know, he was hating on David because David was the anointed king. "Now, what have I done?" David asked. "Can I even ask a question?" He turned to another man and asked him the same question. And every time he asked, he got the same answer. Some men heard that David had said, and they told Saul, who sent for him. David said to Saul, "Your Majesty, no one should be afraid of this Philistine. I will go and fight him." "No," answered Saul. "How could you fight him? You're just a boy, and he has been a soldier all his life." "Your Majesty," David said, "I can take care of my father's sheep any time a lion or a bear carries off a lamb. I go after it, attack it, and rescue the lamb. And if the lion or bear turns on me, I grab it by the throat and beat it to death. I have killed lions and bears, and I would do the same to this heathen Philistine who has defied the army of the living God. The Lord has saved me from lions and bears. He will save me from this Philistine." "All right," Saul answered, "go, and the Lord be with you." He gave his own armor to David for him to wear, a bronze helmet which he put on, David's head, and a coat of armor. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor and tried to walk, but he couldn't because he wasn't used to wearing them. "I cannot fight with all of this," he said to Saul. "I'm not used to it." So he took it all off. So whenever you step out by faith to fight the enemy, there's always somebody around to discourage you. Tell me that's not true. And often it begins in your own home. David's eldest brother, Eliab, became angry when he heard that David was inquiring about Saul's offer, and he ended up ridiculing David. "We are soldiers, and all you are is a shepherd boy. You came to see the battle. Go home and take care of your little flock and leave the fighting to us." Of course, the fact that there had been no battle did not embarrass Eliab. And he also forgot that David had originally come in order to deliver food for him, Abinadab, and Shammah. These three men had seen David anointed by Samuel. but they still did not understand what it meant. They were simply hating on him. As a prophet once said, a man's foes shall be their own. Sorry, what it is Jesus Christ in Matthew 10. A man's foes shall be they of his own household. Yeah, that's what it is. And that promise was true in David's life. It was also true in the life of Joseph, whose brothers hated him, lied about him, and sold him for a slave. Moses was criticized by his own brother and sister. And our Lord's earthly family at one time misunderstood him and opposed his ministry. Yes, the Lord's own family. In Mark chapter 3, 31 through 35, and John chapter 7, verse 1 through 10. But David did not allow Eliab's harsh words to discourage him, for he knew that God could help him defeat the giant. But King Saul was not any more help either in what he said or what he advised. He said, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are young, and he's a man of war from his youth." Saul was echoing the report of the 10 unbelieving spies who saw the giants in Canaan and decided that it was impossible to enter the land. Remember Numbers chapter 13? When we walk by sight, we calculate everything from the human perspective. That's the problem. And this always leads to discouragement. But when we walk by faith, when we do, God comes into the equation and then changes the results. So David had experienced the power of God in his own life, and he knew that the Lord could turn weakness into power. Okay, let's continue here. 40. He took his shepherd's stick and then picked up 5 smooth stones from the stream and put them in his bag. With his sling ready, he went out to meet Goliath. The Philistine started walking toward David with his shield bearer walking in front of him. He kept coming closer, and when he got a good look at David, he was filled with scorn for him because he was just a nice, good-looking boy. He said to David, "What is that stick for? Do you think I'm a dog?" And he called down curses from his God on David. "Come on," he challenged David, "and I will give your body to the birds and animals to eat." David answered, "You are coming against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the Israelite armies, which you have defied. This very day the Lord will put you in my power. I will defeat you and cut off your head, and I will give the bodies of the Philistine soldiers to the birds and animals to eat. Then the whole world will know that Israel has a God, and everyone here will see that the Lord does not need swords or spears to save his people. He is victorious in battle, and he will put all of you in our power." So it's unfortunate that this dramatic account is considered primarily a children's story, or the basis for an allegory, about defeating the giants in our lives, if you will. While there are many applications of a Bible passage, there is only one basic interpretation. And the interpretation here is that David did what he did for the glory of God. It's plain and simple. David came to the contest in the name of the Lord, the God of the armies of Israel. And he wanted Goliath, the Philistine army, and all the earth to know that the true and living God was Israel's God. Goliath had ridiculed Israel's God and actually blasphemed his name. But David was about to set the record straight. David saw this as a contest between the true God of Israel and the false gods of the Philistines. God wants to use his people to magnify his name to all the nations of the earth. This purpose was involved in the call of Abraham and God's choice of the people of Israel. One purpose for Israel's journey in Egypt and the judgments God sent against Pharaoh was the proclaiming of God's name and glory to all the earth. The parting of the Red Sea to let Israel out and opening up the Jordan River to let them into Canaan also bore witness to all the nations that Israel's God was the true God. Even the building of the temple was a witness to the Gentile nation of Israel's God, so that they might know him and fear him. What the Lord did through David will be recorded and told around the world and bring great honor to the name of the Lord. Now, the very weapon that David used, a sling, was a shepherd's weapon, almost a toy of a child, and yet God used it to defeat the giant and the Philistine army, technically. When Goliath saw a young boy coming with a sling in one hand and a staff in the other, he laughed at him. "Am I a dog that you come with me with a stick?" But David announced that his real power was the name of the Lord of hosts, the name that Goliath and the Philistines had insulted. Let's continue. Goliath started walking toward David again, and David ran quickly toward the Philistine battle line to fight him. He reached into his bag, took out a stone, which he slung at Goliath. It hit him on the forehead and broke his skull, and Goliath fell face downward on the ground. And so without a sword, David defeated and killed Goliath with a sling and a stone. He ran to him, stood over him, took Goliath's sword out of its sheath, and cut off his head and killed him. So the Lord uses means to accomplish his purposes, and David was a prepared servant for this occasion. As a shepherd alone in the fields, he had learned to trust God, and as a faithful guardian of the flock, he had mastered the use of the sling. David had confident faith in God because he had found him dependable in the crisis of his life, and he knew that the Lord would not desert him now. The Spirit of God lived in David's body and would enable him to win the battle. And God guided the stone, and it sank into the giant's forehead, and he fell on his face before the two armies. David stood over the fallen giant, took out the giant's sword, and cut off his head, an act that not only guaranteed the victim's death, but also humiliating him and his army and announcing total victory. 51. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they ran away. The men of Israel and Judah shouted and ran after them, pursuing them all the way to Gath and to the gates of Ekron. The Philistines fell wounded all along the road that leads to Sharaim, as far as Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites came back from pursuing the Philistines, they looted their camp. David got Goliath's head and took it to Jerusalem, but he kept Goliath's weapons in his own tent. So even as a youth, David displayed one of the marks of a great leader. He took the risk and opened the way so that others could share in the victory. The Philistines did not keep their part of the bargain. They did not submit to Israel. Remember they were supposed to? Instead, they fled in fear. So the Jews chased them at least 10 miles to the cities of Gath, which was Goliath's hometown, by the way, and Ekron, destroying the enemy soldiers all the way. It turned out to be a tremendous victory for Saul's army. When the Israelites returned to the Philistine camp, they claimed the spoils of the victory that the Lord and David had won. David apparently accompanied the men in chasing the enemy and began to get the reputation of being a brave soldier. He stripped the giant and took his armor and put it in his tent. Later, Goliath's sword would show up in the Jewish priests in the city of the town of Nob, N-O-B. This is in chapter 21, by the way, of this book. So David must have dedicated it to the Lord by giving it to the priest. So when did David take Goliath's head to Jerusalem? Probably later, when he conquered the city and made it his capital, in 2 Samuel chapter 5. The city was known as Jebus in that day and was inhabited by the Jebusites. So this verse was written into the text later when the name had been changed. When David moved into the city as king, he no doubt brought with him many precious trophies from his battles. I'm sure the head of Goliath was one of them. Let's continue. When Saul saw David going out to fight Goliath, he asked Abner, the commander of his army, "Abner, whose son is he?" "I have no idea, your majesty," Abner answered. "Then go and find out," Saul ordered. So when David returned to camp after killing Goliath, Abner took him to Saul. David was still carrying Goliath's head. Saul asked him, "Young man, whose son are you?" I am the son of your servant Jesse from Bethlehem, David answered. So when Jonathan attacked the Philistine output, we're going to read about that. Saul was a spectator, and his bad decisions almost cost him a victory. And once again, Saul merely watched as David defeated the enemy single-handedly. This would be Saul's pattern of leadership to the tragic end of his life. Saul knew who David was, but he asked Abner who the lad's father was, for in that day, that was how people were identified. Jesse had been mentioned earlier in Saul's circle, but perhaps Abner was not present, and Saul may easily have forgotten. As Saul's minstrel, his musician, David went back and forth between home and the camp, and he was present only when Saul was oppressed by the evil spirit. So we can excuse Saul for not knowing who Jesse was. The victor's family was relieved of paying taxes, and he would marry Saul's daughter as part of the bargain. So Saul would have to inquire about the father. Finally, Saul may have wanted to know if there were any more men like David back home. He probably did not know that 3 of David's brothers were in his own army, but he could have used a few more men like David, that's for sure. The result of the day's victory was that David was added permanently to Saul's staff. So, faith in God makes us participants with the Lord in the battle for truth. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. This is from 1 John chapter 5, verse 4. All right, people. We're going to do our quiz question.